And say good evening, folks. Welcome to another in our series on the book of Acts. I'd like to start this evening with a reading of Psalm 31. Psalm 31. In you, O Lord, do I take refuge. Let me never be put to shame. In your righteousness, deliver me. Incline your ear to me. Rescue me speedily. Be a rock of refuge for me, a strong fortress to save me. For you are my rock and my fortress, and for your name's sake you lead me and guide me. You take me out of the net they have hidden for me, for you are my refuge. Into your hand I commit my spirit, you who have redeemed me, O Lord, faithful God. I hate those who pay regard to worthless idols, but I trust in the Lord. I will rejoice and be glad in your steadfast love, because you have seen my affliction. You have known the distress of my soul, and you have not delivered me into the hand of my enemy. You have set my feet in a broad place. Be gracious to me, O Lord, for I am in distress. My eye is wasted from grief, my soul and my body also, for my life is spent with sorrows and my years with sighing. My strength fails because of my iniquity, and my bones waste away. Because of all my adversaries, I have become a reproach, especially to my neighbors, and an object of dread to my acquaintances. Those who see me in the street flee from me. I have been forgotten like one who is dead. I have become like a broken vessel, for I hear the whispering of many, terror on every side, as they scheme together against me, as they plot to take my life. But I trust in you, O Lord. I say, you are my God. My times are in your hand. Rescue me from the hand of the enemies and from my persecutors. Make your face shine on your servant. Save me in your steadfast love. O Lord, let me not be put to shame, for I call upon you. Let the wicked be put to shame. Let them go silently to Sheol. Let the lying lips be mute, which speak insolently against the righteous in pride and contempt. Oh, how abundant is your goodness, which you have stored up for those who fear you and worked for those who take refuge in you. In the sight of the children of mankind, in the cover of your presence, you hide them. From the plots of men, you store them in your shelter from strife of tongues. Blessed be the Lord, for he has for he has wondrously shown his steadfast love to me. When I was in a besieged city, I had said in my alarm, I am cut off from your sight. But you heard the voice of my pleas for mercy when I cried to you for help. Love the Lord, all you his saints. The Lord preserves the faithful, but abundantly repays the one who acts in pride. Be strong. Let your heart take courage, all you who wait for the Lord. So, as I said before we got the recording underway, we are in Acts chapter 25 this evening. We're going to be looking at the first 22 verses, which I will read here in just a moment. This is following right on the heels of Acts chapter 24. Paul had appeared before Felix, the then governor over the province of Judea. Felix was removed from office because of his heavy hand that he was using against the Jews when he was ruling there. And he was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and I'll tell you a little bit about him very in just a few minutes here. Festus is in office for just 2 years before he dies in office, but by all accounts, the Jews really liked him. He was a fair and honorable man. He was a just individual. But it's interesting to read here as he takes office, the Jews immediately pounce. Uh, he comes to he comes into the governor's office there in Caesarea, and very shortly after arriving there, he goes to Jerusalem, the capital city of Judea. The purpose there being to meet with the Jewish elite, with the principal men, with the leaders. He's a new governor there. He doesn't know anything about the Jewish people. And so he goes to where the head Jews, the main Jews, the important Jews, the influential Jews are, to meet with them, to learn about them, to discuss with them the grievances they might have against Rome and maybe grievances that Rome has against them and see what accord that they can come to. And as I said, by all accounts, he seems to have been a fair and just individual. He showed, according to Josephus, he showed some degree of tolerance for Jewish customs that he himself did not agree with. So the Jews kind of liked him. He was a much better ruler than was his predecessor, and tremendously better than his successor. This is going to be a time of relative peace between Rome and the Jews. But when Festus dies in office around 62 AD, things are going to really stir up. His successor is another brutal man, by all accounts. And within 4 years, the Roman-Jewish war is going to begin. And it will be protracted for about 4 years until the general Titus, under the uh, rule of his father, Vespasian the emperor, lays siege to Jerusalem, sacks it, burns it to the ground, destroys the temple, and leaves it in the ruins that it is to this day. Um, we're right on the cusp of all of those events blowing up as Paul is appearing here before Festus in this chapter. So Festus, he goes up to Jerusalem, like I said, to meet with the chief priests or the principal men. And I don't know if Luke's narration here, and Luke may be cutting out a lot of the other details, but he immediately jumps to them laying out the case against Paul. The Jews haven't forgotten Paul. Paul has been in the Herod's Praetorium there, as we learned from the last verse of Acts chapter 23. He's been in Herod's Praetorium for 2 years now, since Festus left office, and um, before uh, be, since Felix left office, I'm sorry, and before Festus comes in, then you get the names confused, or at least I get the names confused. But the Jews haven't forgotten that this man is there and that they have this grievance against him. And so they lay out the case against Paul, and they urge him as a favor against Paul. There's this man who is imprisoned there in Caesarea. We'd like you to bring him down here so that we can try him according to our laws and deal with him. And we're just going to take this off of your hands. So you don't have to deal with this at the beginning of your rule as governor. This is a favor we want to do for you because we like you so much, and we can already tell you're going to be a more reasonable man than your predecessor. So if you could just hand him over to us, that would be swell. Luke tells us in verse 3 that they were planning an ambush to kill him on the way. This is the second time they've plotted an ambush against Paul. They meet with the same degree of non-success that they did previously when Paul's nephew overheard the first plot and exposed that plot to the tribune there in Jerusalem, and he spirited Paul away to Caesarea, where he has been. So Festus answers them in verse 4, saying, well, Paul's in Caesarea. I'm going there anyway. Why don't you come along with me? And there you can lay out your case before me at the governor's seat, where it's proper for such proceedings to take place, unknowingly thwarting the plan of the Jews, who will do anything that they possibly can to kill Paul. And that's an important point to keep in mind, that the Jews only have one answer for Paul. They're going to kill him. He will never stand trial in Jerusalem. They're going to kill him. He's going to be shot while attempting to escape en route to Jerusalem, or some other disaster is going to befall him, an accident's going to happen, and Paul's going to end up mysteriously dead. Festus doesn't know these things, though, so he suggests to the Jews, let's all go to where Paul is, rather than sending for him and then waiting for him to be brought down here. It's quicker. Let's go that way. I'm going that way anyway. So after some days, we're told in verse 6, no more than 8 or 10 days, he went down to Caesarea. The Jews come with him. And the very next day, he sets up the tribunal and orders Paul to be brought in. This tells us that Festus is an organized man, that he acts quickly and decisively, like uh, Lysias, the guy in Jerusalem, and orders Paul to be brought in. Verse 7 says that when Paul arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him that they could not prove. I love how Luke summarizes what must have been a very long discussion, a long degree of argument poured out before Festus. The bottom line being they can't prove any of these charges. When you look at what's going on here, there are some similarities between this trial and the trial that Jesus stood in Luke chapter 23. Uh, there's a bunch of parallels. One of the writers I was reading lists about a dozen of them. I just want to bring four of them to your attention that I thought are kind of interesting. Both in the trial of Jesus and here in the trial of Paul, there are four main characters. We have a Roman governor. In the case of Jesus, it was Pilate. We have a Herodian prince. In the case of Jesus, it's Herod. Here it's going to be Agrippa II, who is from the Herodian line. We have the Jewish elite, the high priests, who are levying accusations against the the defendant, and then we have the defendants, Jesus and Paul. In both cases, with Jesus and with Paul, both the Roman governor and the representative of the Herodian house find the defendant innocent. Festus is going to make a statement in Acts chapter 26 that, or rather in Acts chapter 25 that we'll get to next week, that this man hasn't done anything deserving of death. And Agrippa at the end of chapter 26 is going to agree. This man hasn't done anything deserving death. Pilate said of Jesus, this man hasn't done anything deserving death. He sent Jesus to Herod, who sent Jesus back to Pilate, and by his very silence agreed there's no charge against this man. Otherwise, because he was the ruler there in Judea, had Jesus been guilty of something, he would have passed sentence himself because it was his responsibility first and then Pilate's. In fact, each governor or each governor, Pilate, and Festus are going to state three times that the guy standing before them is innocent. The defendant is accused by a Jewish high priest in Luke chapter 23, verse 2, here in Acts chapter 25, verse 2. They're both going to demand death. The Jewish elite wanted Jesus dead. The Jewish elite here want Paul dead because, and here's the reason, we want these guys to die because they're a threat to Rome. The Jews stated that Jesus was a rabble-rouser and a threat to Rome. The Jews have stated the same thing about Paul, and for acts against Israel. Both cases, though, they make it a political argument when they go before the governor. A political argument based on a theological difference of opinion. And the Roman governor in Jesus' trial saw through that. The Roman governor in Paul's trial is going to see through it as well. It's some very interesting things. There are other parallels that can be brought, but these four here kind of show that Paul, um, like Stephen before him, is imitating Jesus in the suffering that he's enduring. And when you look in Colossians chapter 1, Paul makes a statement concerning that suffering. He says in Colossians chapter 1 and verse 24, "Now I rejoice in my sufferings for your sake," that is for you, you brethren in Colossae. For and in my flesh I am filling up what is lacking in Christ's afflictions for the sake of his body, that is the church. Now, Paul's not saying there that Jesus didn't suffer enough, so I'm going to outsuffer Jesus. No. Paul is saying, I haven't suffered enough. He knows, number one, that he used to persecute the church. And so any suffering that he meted out, he feels is due him. It's only fair and it's just. And also that Jesus suffered unjustly and was persecuted unjustly. And so Paul says, this is the lot I've chosen. All of the suffering that can come my way, I'll take it. And I'll do it gladly for the sake of Jesus, for the sake of my example to you, the church, to build you up and show you this is the path of the disciple. You remember some weeks ago, I mentioned the guy in Luke who says to Jesus, I'll follow you anywhere. And Jesus responds to him saying, foxes have dens, birds of the air have nests. I have no place to lay my head. The implication being, are you really ready and willing to go where I'm about to go? Because he's heading to Jerusalem to go to the cross. Are you willing to follow that path of suffering? So I'm going to read this section here to you because I don't think I have yet, and and then we'll make a few comments on it. I know I've prefaced this with a 20-minute introduction. So Acts chapter 25, verses 1 to 22. Now, 3 days after Festus had arrived in the province, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea, and the chief priests and the principal men of the Jews laid out their case against Paul, and they urged him, asking as a favor against Paul that he summon him to Jerusalem, because they were planning an ambush to kill him on the way. Festus replied that Paul was being kept in Caesarea, and that he himself intended to go there shortly. So he said, let the men of authority among you go down with me, and if there is anything wrong about the man, let them bring charges against him. I think I've already read this. I'm pretty sure I already read this. I don't know. Did I read this? I don't remember. I'd have to back the tape up, but we'll read it again. He stayed then not more than 8 or 10 days. He went down to Caesarea, and the next day he took a seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. When he had arrived, the Jews came, who had come down from Jerusalem, stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him that they could not prove. Paul argued in his defense, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I committed any offense. But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges before me? But Paul said, I'm standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you yourself know very well. If then I am a wrongdoer, and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death. But if there is nothing to their charges against me, no one can give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar. Then Festus, when he had conferred with his council, answered, to Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go. Now when some days had passed, Agrippa the king and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and greeted Festus. As they stayed there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, there is a man left prisoner by Felix. And when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews laid out their case against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. I answered them that it's not the custom of the Romans to give anyone up before the accused met the accusers face to face and had opportunity to make his defense concerning the charges laid against him. So when they came together here, I made no delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought. When the accusers stood up, they brought no charge in his case of such evils as I supposed. Rather, they had certain points of dispute with him about their own religion, and about a certain Jesus who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. Being at a loss as how to investigate these questions, I asked whether he wanted to go to Jerusalem and be tried there regarding them. But when Paul had appealed to be kept in custody for the decision of the emperor, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, he said, you will hear him. No, I had not read that all, the entire thing to you before getting going here. So Festus, the Jews come, and back in chapter 24, they make their case. They make their case vehemently, probably loudly. But Luke underscores the fact that they can't prove the charges. Now, these charges are 2 years old. They didn't have any witnesses when they came before Felix. They probably don't have any witnesses right here and right now as they're speaking before Festus. It was the Jews from Ephesus, from Asia, who seized Paul initially in the temple courts and brought forth the charge of Paul defiling the temple. The Jewish the Jews in Jerusalem aren't going to go to Asia to find witnesses against Paul. They figure they've got the new guy in town. We can bull this thing through. We can get this one past him. He's the newbie. He doesn't know the ropes. He doesn't know the Jews. He doesn't know our plots and our shenanigans. If we go before him and we make a large enough presentation of voices and force, he'll see the right of our case. But he doesn't. Couldn't prove their case against him. And so Luke sums up Paul's defense in verse 8. I haven't violated the laws of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I committed any offense. I have done no wrong. And these guys can't prove it. And so Festus, we're told, wants to do a favor for the Jews. After all, they came all the way from Jerusalem to Caesarea to be here. Obviously, this matter means something to them. Asks Paul, would you like to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there before me? Festus is planning to go there in my presence and answer these charges. Paul doesn't know Festus. He doesn't know if he can trust Festus. He knows he can't trust the Jews. And so his answer is, this is Caesar's court right here. I am before Caesar's representative right here. The change of venue isn't going to make any difference to the fact that I am standing before the individual before whom I ought to be tried, because they're bringing charges of political sedition against me. You are the political representative. If I've done something deserving death, so be it. Order me to be executed, and I won't resist. I'm ready to die, Paul says. But if there's nothing in their charges against me, if their charges don't have any substance, I'm a Roman citizen. Nobody can hand me over to their hands. I'm here in protective custody. And then he makes the statement, I appeal to Caesar. And that's really the crux of what we're looking at this evening. Paul says, I'm guilty of no wrongdoing. I can't be handed over to the Jews. If you're not going to settle this matter, then I appeal to Caesar. Now, Festus has the right, as the governor, to acquit Paul on the spot, to dismiss the charges, set him free, tell the Jews to go back home. When Paul makes the appeal, that ends these legal proceedings. The Jews can make no further arguments. The case is done. Festus has to send them on the way because when a Roman citizen appeals to be heard before the people, that is to go before the emperor and his court, he is bound to honor that request, even though he can release him from it. So Paul's appeal here really upsets the Jews' apple cart, so to speak. Um, Paul knows that if he goes to Jerusalem, it doesn't end well for him. He knows that Jesus has told him, "You are going to go and testify in Rome." And by appealing to Caesar, he makes it incumbent on the Romans to get him there. The Romans now have to take Paul and bring him into Jerusalem, where he can plead his case before the Roman emperor. It's an interesting thing that he does here by invoking that right that he has. And it does something very interesting for Festus. Festus wanted to do a favor for the Jews. Now he can't. And so Paul has solved one of Festus's problems. That is, what to do about the Jews and these arguments and these charges that they're bringing. Because, as I said, appealing to Caesar, that ends that and shuts that door. But it gives Festus another problem. Because to send Paul to Rome, to send him to the emperor, he has to send a letter with Paul listing out the charges, listing out the case against Paul. And the Jews have made this difficult because they have stressed a political charge against Paul, saying that they wanted to try Paul themselves in Jerusalem. This man is a political rebel. Bring him to us, and we'll pass justice. Paul's argument has been, we have a theological disagreement. I insist on Roman justice. So Festus has to come up with a reason why he's sending Paul to the emperor Nero at this time. Because one thing you don't want to do is waste the emperor's time by sending a trivial matter to be decided before him. Because once the emperor starts thinking that one of his governors is incompetent, that man isn't governor for very long. He'll get removed from his office. And so he's left with a conundrum. What do I do with this? How can I send you before the emperor when I don't have a good reason to do so? A reason that's going to matter, a reason that's going to catch the interest of the emperor. And so Festus may very well be contemplating dismissing the charges and letting Paul go free. Like I said, he has that right. He confers with his council in verse 12. He has to confer with them to determine whether or not he's going to honor this appeal that Paul has made. He confers with them and he then says, you've appealed to Caesar you're going to go. And then he goes home and sits down scratching his head saying, what do I say in the letter that I sent along? It just so happens, coincidentally, that after some days passed in verse 13, here comes Agrippa the king and Bernice, his sister, who have come to welcome the new governor to the province of Judea and who are of the Jewish faith. Uh, the Herodian line was Jewish, and we know that Bernice, and I'll talk about who these individuals are in just a moment here, was considered pious or devout, at least insofar as the Herodians were considered pious and devout, and that's a pretty low bar. Here comes the answer. Festus is going to discuss this case with the king. So he can send the letter to Nero saying, I discussed this matter with the king, and we agreed that this man needs to come before you. He can hide behind Herod Agrippa and say, he said that we ought to send Paul to you. And that sort of legitimizes his sending Paul. And it just so happens that Herod shows up. I'm sure God had nothing to do with that in the timing of things that worked out so very well for Paul. So Herod Agrippa the second is the individual we read about in verse 13. Agrippa the king and Bernice his sister. Agrippa the first, who we read about in Acts chapter 12, verse 1, uh, who seized some of the disciples and put James, the apostle, the brother of John, to death with the sword, had arrested Peter, and Peter has that miraculous escape from prison. This Agrippa is that Herod's son. Herod Agrippa the first had two sons, Drusus, who died in childhood. Agrippa the second had three daughters, Bernice, Mariamne, and Drusilla. Drusilla we read about, who was Festus's wife, or not Festus's wife, Felix's wife before Festus shows up. Um, don't know much about the middle one, but Bernice, we'll talk about her in just a moment. She's fairly well known. He was born in AD 27 and was 17 years old when his father died in Acts chapter 12. Tiberius Caesar wanted to send him immediately to Judea and put him on his father's throne. Not who did I say? Tiberius, not Tiberius, Claudius, sorry. Wanted to send him there, but his advisors reasoned with him and said, no, he's too young to take over such a troublesome province. Give him some lesser responsibilities and let him grow into that. And which is what he did. He placed him elsewhere. And gradually he was given more and more and more authority and more territory. So this Agrippa here, he's the great grandson of Herod the Great, who built the temple that the Romans are going to destroy. He comes to greet Festus and brings along his sister, Bernice. Uh, Luke uses the shortened form of her name here, and so do some other ancient writers, but the longer form of her name is Berenice. It just drops a syllable, which is interesting because when you translate that into Latin, you get the name Veronica, because the way Latin transliterates the Greek. She doesn't have a speaking part, but Luke includes mention of her because she was prominent. She was very well known among the Jews. She was a Jewish sympathizer and had stood at times dangerously against Rome in favor of the Jews. She does participate in the innocent verdict in Acts chapter 26, verses 30 and 31. She was born in AD 28, a year after her brother Agrippa. She married at the age of 13. She married Marcus Alexander in AD 41. He died shortly after their marriage, and so her father, Agrippa the First, the guy in Acts chapter 12, married her off to her uncle Herod, who was then king of Chalcis. She was 16 when her father died, and her then husband died maybe 4 or 5 years later. So she came to spend time with her brother, Agrippa II. We're now at the age of 20, 21, maybe, somewhere in there. She stayed with Agrippa that we're reading about here in Acts chapter 25 for quite some time until rumors of an incestuous relationship started being bandied about. They're probably not true because, as I said, she was considered to be a fairly devout um, Jew, as at least in comparison with the rest of the Herodian line. But what's most well known about her is I mentioned earlier the Roman general Titus and his father, the Emperor Vespasian. She became the mistress of Titus, the Roman general, and they lived together even when Titus became emperor. He never married her because the Senate would have considered that a scandalous thing, but they lived together in in obviously a common law type marriage or in a physical relationship type thing while Titus was emperor. So she became a woman of some influence and some power. But this visit that they pay here, and like I said, it gives Festus aid in writing this letter that he has to write to the emperor to legitimize sending Paul. And so after some days, they come and they visit with Felix. Festus brings up the matter of Paul in verse 14, saying, "There's a man left prisoner here by Felix. When I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews laid out their case against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. They want the death penalty. And they're pretty vehement about it. I told them, verse 16, it's not the custom of the Romans to give anyone up before the accused met the accusers face to face and had opportunity to make his defense concerning the charge laid against him. We say a lot against the Roman government and how the Romans oppressed the Jews and how the Romans uh, were enemies of Christianity late in Nero's life. They would become enemies of the Romans. But they did have a very solid system of law in place. And Paul here is using that system of law to protect himself from the the Jews who are seeking his head and to eventually get to Rome. Which brings up the question, I mentioned Nero as the emperor. Of all the Roman emperors that you could appeal to go and stand before, how many of you would pick Nero, knowing what you know about Nero? Probably nobody. Nero, why would Paul appeal to Nero? You might say, well, he knows he's going to die with the Jews. At least before Nero, he'll get to state his case before Nero has him executed. In the early part of Nero's reign, and this is still in the early part of Nero's reign, Nero was under the tutelage of the Stoic philosopher Seneca before Nero went nuts and had Seneca executed. The early part of his reign was a time of peace. He was said to be a decent ruler in the early part of his reign. It's not until later in his reign that he gets off the rails and goes nuts, sets Rome on fire, and reputedly fiddles while Rome is burning, for which he blames the Christians. And the persecution against the Christians arises, and all the atrocities that you have either heard or read about in other classes or in your own studies take place. But when Paul makes his appeal, Nero is still clear thinking, at least so far as Nero can be said to be clear thinking. He's more or less in his right mind. So he's appealing to an emperor who at that time will hear him But Paul's going to go and testify before Caesar in Rome anyway. Jesus said, "You bore witness to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so also you are going to bear witness to me in Jerusalem." Acts chapter 23 and verse 11. So Festus says, "You know it's not the policy of the Romans to hand a man over to condemnation without hearing the trial, without hearing things out." And I like how he summarizes the um, the the argument against them here, uh, saying they came in verse 17. I made no delay. Next day, brought Paul in. When they stood up to bring charges, they didn't bring the charges I thought they were going to bring. They didn't accuse this man of evil like I expected, but had certain points of a dispute with him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. That's his summary of the case of the Jews and Paul's defense of Christianity. It's their dispute is over this Jesus fellow who the Jews had put to death under Pilate, but Paul says no, he's alive. And that doesn't square with Festus's understanding of the world, and he's going to say in later in Acts chapter 26, verse 24, Festus said with a loud voice, "Paul, you're out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you out of your mind," because he can't accept the resurrection of Jesus. But Festus is, and that's the crux of his puzzlement, is how do I explain to Nero that I'm sending this man because he believes that a dead man's alive, and he wants to stand before you and make testimony about that. That's a waste of Nero's time. He can't do this thing. So I'm at a loss as how to investigate this. I'm at a loss as how to proceed with this. What do I do here? I asked whether he wanted to go to Jerusalem and be charged there in front of me. And he said no. Rather, he's appealing to Caesar. He wants to go and stand before the emperor. And I'm at a loss as to what to do. So now he's seeking the advice, he's seeking the counsel of this king. And so Agrippa makes a statement in verse 22, which is where we're going to end. I would like to hear this man myself. Agrippa wants to hear the case himself. Now he knows something of, and we'll find that out next week when we listen to Paul's testimony before Agrippa. He knows the prophecies. He knows the things that the Jews are talking about. He's got that understanding. Jesus had told the apostles back when he was on his earthly ministry that you're going to stand before kings and you're going to bear witness in my name. Next week, when we read through this section, Acts chapter 26, Acts 20, actually, we got to finish 25. Oh, it'll be Acts 25, verse 23 through 26, verse 32 that we'll look at next week. But when Paul stands before Agrippa, he's standing before a king. He's not a major king, if I can say that about a guy who was a king. He's not a super important king, but he's still a king. Paul is going to stand before the Roman emperor, the most powerful man in the world at that time. And he's going to preach the gospel of Jesus. He's not going to answer charges against the accusations. He's simply going to lay out his testimony and bear witness to the resurrected Jesus before the emperor, as Jesus said he would, as Jesus told the apostles, you'll stand before the high and the mighty, and you'll bear witness in my name. and you'll preach to the poor and to the lowly and to the humble and the obscure and bear witness to my name. The underscoring of everything that we need to be doing is bearing witness to the name of Jesus. Probably none of us are going to stand before kings. Probably none of us know any kings. Um, or if we do, they're few and far between, and the connections are very remote and very distant. But we have people in our lives that we can talk to. Everyone here knows somebody who needs Jesus. And we can tell those people about Jesus. We can explain what Jesus has done for us in our lives. We can show by the way we live the difference that Jesus is making in our lives. We can show the love of Jesus to those around us. We can make ourselves about being those ambassadors that we're called to be, appealing to God, appealing to others to be reconciled to God for their sake, they might escape the coming judgment. And so Agrippa says to Festus in verse 22, I want to hear him myself. I'm intrigued now. This has captured his interest. And Paul is going to say in 26 verse 2, I consider myself fortunate that it is before you, King Agrippa, that I'm going to make my defense today against all the accusations of the Jews, because you're familiar with the controversies of the Jews. Agrippa will be able to see and hear the truth of what Paul is saying, where Festus, the newcomer who hasn't been governor of the province of Judea for more than a couple of weeks now, so he's not up to speed. And I think that's one of the reasons why Paul appeals to Caesar. Festus is wanting to hand him over to the Jews, get this off of my hands. And Paul says, no, that's not where I need to go. I need to go before Caesar. That's where my Lord is sending me. I need to follow that path. And he gets the answer: to Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go. So I'm going to end the recording there. And this is, hey, look at that, 10 minutes early tonight. You guys are getting off quick.